Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praisify podcast. Today I am beginning a three-part series on C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, where we discuss the three essays, The Men Without Chests, The Way, and The Abolition of Man. Today we are beginning with Men Without Chests, and I am joined by Logos and Master Sanders. So if we look at the first part of this, C.S. Lewis introduces the Little Green Book, which is just sort of a stand-in for progressive education as a grammar book. And he complains about how they view statements of value. So according to him, the Little Green Book states that a statement X is sublime is not really at all a statement about X, but about the subjective feeling of the speaker. And then C.S. Lewis concludes from this that the student who reads this will conclude that all statements of value are descriptions of one's emotional state, and then two such statements are meaningless. He then calls foul and says that this is a kind of third-rate philosophy masquerading as grammar. But let's start with this claim, though, that this emotivist claim that the statement attributing a positive or negative trait to a thing is merely a description of one's internal state. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't reveal anything about one's internal feelings, but I think there's a lot of reasons to argue that to merely say it reflects one's internal feelings is problematic, as we'll begin to get into. So why don't we throw the ball to you, Logos?
Yeah, this is really complicated. I had to listen to this thing twice and give it some real thought because I think there's like 3 or 4 levels to the analysis here. If we look at the immediate historical context Lewis is writing this in, logical positivists are kind of running amok. You've got the new iteration of Hume's fork, where all statements about things are either definitions or empirically verifiable in some way. But you also have this weird class of propositions where X is beautiful, for example. Well, you can't just define something as beautiful because there's some experience that goes with it, but it's not purely empirical because two people could look at the same thing, for example, and disagree on whether it's beautiful or not. And so the positivist would have to say something like, okay, well, things like beauty and value judgments might just be reflective of our internal value states about a thing. So it's almost like they're reflecting our empirical observations about our mental states when observing the thing. And I can see why Lewis would have a problem with that. He's not a big fan of logical positivism. And also, as he's going to go on to talk about later, there are some problems if you just boil things ethically down to emotions. But there's other problems too. I mean, there's other layers to think about. So let's suppose we're eating a pizza together, right? We have the same pizza right in front of us. Now, objectively, we can talk about things that are just true about the pizza, the sauce, the cheese, the crust, and we could say objectively these things are in the pizza. But we could eat the pizza and we could say something like, this is the best pizza I've ever had, or this pizza is terrible. And nobody'd bat an eye if we all ate the same pizza and kind of had like different internal understandings of the pizza. Now, if the statements about, this pizza is sublime or this pizza is terrible are both saying things about the pizza, well, then we risk a problem of having an internal contradiction in the pizza itself. It's both sublime and the worst pizza ever. And so there is kind of a problem to solve there. And I also feel that segueing this into the other layer of analysis, Lewis has kind of waded into a more deeper problem of philosophy where how much of our experiences are mind-centered, where you have the rationalist, the empiricist, Kant, and you have this big old contextual backdrop where all of this is going on. So reading through it, I get the idea that if he's just critiquing emotivist ethics, I get the idea, the criticism, and I think it's a fair criticism to have. But there are other strings he's tugging on in the analysis that I don't think he is given the room to breathe in the first section of his book.
What are some of your thoughts on this first stage here, Master Sanders?
Well, I kind of, there's not a whole lot I can add to what Logo said, but I do think it was interesting that he is very concerned with this sort of deconstructivist attitude. And we're talking a little bit before chat, before this stream, as to whether or not he might have been anticipating some of the problems of postmodernism, although that hasn't happened yet exactly at this time. But a lot of these similar problems have happened today, where we sort of attribute things to either the subjective experience or to what society says at large, and we use that to sort of we use that in a way to say that objective knowledge or objective value is impossible to find simply because a lot of it is defined by either experience or by society. And with that, however, our society, as Lewis points out, still wants to have the benefits of that. We still want to have the benefits of this moral, objective moralism, while at the same time deconstructing it. And we're surprised that we've gotten to this point. And it was quite prescient about our current time, where we're facing some of those similar problems, where we're advocating this sort of quasi-Christian ethic or social ethic when it comes to politics or to culture, and yet we've done as much as we can to remove that aspect, remove any credence we have in objective moral truth. So I think he was quite prescient on that.
Yes. As to the pizza logos, Inner City Pigeon says this: New York style pizza is the true and best pizza compared to the Chicago style.
And see, here's the thing: that the New York and Chicago people could eat each other's pizzas and, disagree about the pizzas. And so if the values of the pizzas are in the pizzas, you can have two Schrodinger's pizzas where the pizza is both amazing and terrible, depending on who opens the box or takes a bite of the pizza. That's a weird oddity that kind of pops out of this analysis. And I can see why Lewis is afraid of the ethical implications, but I also don't think he gives a benefit of the doubt to the true problems entangled in the analysis.
Yeah. So the next step, this essay this first essay seems to be divided into kind of like 3 stages. The first stage is this emotivist philosophical stage, where he's breaking down the problems of emotivism. The second stage is him trying to rationalize why they would be doing this. And then the third stage is where he sort of explains the consequences of this. Now, in the second stage, C.S. Lewis talks about how when they have a student read bad grammar, bad literature in the book, they condition the student to think that is bad grammar or bad literature, not so much because it's, A, poorly written, or B, because it's not pointing to the true, the beautiful, and the good, but it's bad because it's trying to hoodwink you, right? It's like, buy this, it'll make you happy, or buy, do this, it'll make you successful, when it won't do any of those things at all. And so, see, one of the things that I have here is he thinks that there are 2 kinds of men who are immune to bad literature, as he calls it. The brute, and then one who has an ordinate desire. The former, having no interest of knowledge or conception of the things, cares not for the allure of artifice. And then the latter can distinguish, because his mind can comprehend the greatness of a thing in relation to the good. And so what Lewis is seeming to say here, that even while this is a grammatical system they're using, it has philosophical implications. Things are good or bad because they're useful. That seems to be maybe a swipe at pragmatism. The idea that, you can't believe that tripe because you're not going to get anywhere near the results that it's telling you you're going to get. And that's what makes literature bad. And C.S. Lewis is like, well, there's other reasons for considering it bad literature, and there's better reasons for considering it bad literature. But if these people are brutes, then they don't really know what is good or bad literature. And so, since this is a grammar book trying to distinguish between the 2, it seems to be catering to a group of people that in principle cannot distinguish between the 2. Look.
Well, I guess I felt a bit attacked in that section because I personally resemble those remarks. I'm probably the brute. We've had many conversations about how much of a Philistine I am. You love Shakespeare. I don't understand it very well, the Old English. I just can't quite get the meaning of the phrases very well. I haven't been taught to read it. There's all sorts of other things. So when we're talking about, good literature and, going highbrow criticism, what makes good literature, I guess I sympathize with Lewis being trained in a tradition that can spot and deal with those things. As Lewis even admits in the essay, doing good literature review is hard, whereas what the schoolmaster is doing is much less hard. And so I guess I have to empathize with the schoolmaster. I'm not a very good literary critic. And so if I use the example of the island cruise that Lewis talks about in the essay, the best I can think about is when they're describing the types of experiences you'll have in the cruise. The best I can do is say something like, well, okay, how likely is it that I'm actually going to have the experiences these people are saying I'm going to have? And if it is likely, are these the kind of experiences that I'm looking for? I have to kind of take things at a more face value level, because I don't really engage very well at the level of metaphor and good flowery literary language. It just doesn't do it for me emotionally.
Well, maybe we could say the Little Green Book has been all too successful. No, but I think one thing to point out though is why Lewis is tying literary criticism, I think, into this discussion of ethics is precisely that which makes literature great, is that literature which does correctly value the true, the beautiful, and the good, and teaches the reader to appropriately value those things as well. I think that's where he brings in the literary criticism. And also, I think he almost has to bring it in because the Little Green Book seems to muddle the two things up. Master Sanders, what are some of your thoughts?
I don't think I can quite add to that, but it does. I can kind of understand Lewis's concerns here on that, given the fact that this was during a time where there was a lot, particularly even in literature, this move toward realism and sort of almost scientific verisimilitude in literature and in other areas of thought, that it would seem, at least for people of this time, it would seem clever to kind of deconstruct these ideas as being silly or just reverting it to the individual there.
Mm-hmm. Now, he then tries to provide answers as to why they're, in our terminology, LARPing as amateur philosophers. He thinks one possible is that it's easier to do what the Little Green Book does than the real thing. Obviously, the other thing could be that they do want, blockheads and brutes, or they have just a defective pedagogy. They have a defective idea of what children need. And he obviously, if they're acting in bad faith, then that answers itself. And so he doesn't go too much into that. He does point out that doing criticism in literature is difficult, which you mentioned already, Logos. So it's easier to do a similitude of the real thing than the real thing. But then I think when he gets to the pedagogy, this is where he has an interesting tripartite breakdown. He says, or my notes say, it is much easier to attack a piece of literature as bad by attacking the emotion that produces it, rather than the actual merits of the work itself. They incorrectly view an overabundance of sentiment as the problem with children, rather than over an abundance of vulgarity. Either way, bad sentiment is not to be replaced with no sentiment, but good sentiment. They might think it necessary to instill some virtues, but not others, yet have set themselves an impossible task on their end. Well, as to the first one, attacking literature is bad based on the emotion that produces it. The left is notorious for this. Anything is bad literature if it's racist, sexist, or whatever, because they attack the emotion of the person who wrote it. Like, I remember when the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out, there was a lot of these kinds of Little Green Book people criticizing it as racist because it's a bunch of essentially white people, and elves and dwarves are inspired by Jews and the elves by Scandinavians fighting Easterlings, Haradrim, dark-skinned men, and orcs. But that's not a legitimate criticism of Lord of the Rings. That's just a Little Green Book criticism. And that really is, I think, epidemic these days. Then he then says that children are not too sentimental. He says they're too practical, and that's the problem. Which I guess even today you could argue is worse. Most people aren't as poetic and sentimental as maybe he would have liked even then, right? Because it's got to be practical. Well, what practical value is this? And then he seems to think then, okay, well, maybe they still want other values, and that they think that those values can be instilled to the children. But if those values are just the result of sentiments that are meaningless, then why should they be valued over any other set of meaningless sentiments? That seems to be the more interesting part in his breaking down of the rationalization for the Little Green Book to people. So, Logos, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, for the most part, I don't know if I have too much comment until we get to the end there, where he says, if things are reducible to sentiments, I don't know why we should value them over any other kinds of sentiments. And I don't know. It just seems like okay. Well, here's some good examples from history where I think this is kind of muddled. Um, if you look at a country, and let's suppose we have this value of patriotism, and a country does something that's inhumane. It's not in pursuit of the good. And there's all sorts of things that you and Keith have talked about in other podcasts that America has done, or maybe the UK has done, and so on and so on and so forth. Um, and so somebody could be like, well, I'm a patriot, so I'm going to have to value those things the country did differently than somebody else who's going to have to value these things differently. It's not so clear that there's one value or one sentiment of value to attach these things, or even just one sentiment at all. It seems like if people want to be conflicted about things their country has done, it's how you get moral change and moral, what's the word I'm looking for? Moral reform, right? So you only get moral reform when you have conflicting values about things that are going on in society and so on and so forth. And you can only get conflicting values if people have different experiences of the things going on. And so it seems to be like you need them both. You kind of need a little bit of the subjective element. And if you try to wipe it out too much, it gets to some, I don't know, I guess some conformist notions that can also be dangerous. Lewis does point out, countries got to get their people to fight the Nazis or whatever. But the other question is, how could you get a Nazi in principle to reform its own state? That's the other side as well. So that's the one thing I had a hard time with this whole work. It's he'd say a string of things I found to be agreeable in of themselves. When you look at the meta-analysis of them, it's just not clear to me that he can argue successfully that having some subjective notion of a thing invalidates all other subjective notions of a thing. In the same way that my tasting of a pizza, a Chicago style pizza versus New York style pizza, different people might prefer their pizzas. It doesn't invalidate either subjective experience. In fact, it might be a part of patriotism that they do value it differently. Local patriotism. A Chicago person loves a Chicago pizza. A New York style person loves a New York pizza. And their differing values in the food they're eating is a very real connection to their own distinct cultures and experiences and what they value about their culture. So I don't know. It just seems more complicated than he's trying to make it out to be.
Yeah, Master Sanders.
Well, before I go, could you clarify how the what you were saying about this kind of Green Book mentality was in the left wing criticisms of Lord of the Rings? Were they saying that were they attacking what they? Okay, was there a basis of attack based on some of the depictions in Tolkien based on Tolkien's perspective, or how did it make the readers feel?
Tolkien's perspective, they were saying it was bad because it was a representation of implicit racism in Tolkien.
Oh, I see. And it kind of reminds me of some of the criticisms that they had that has been leveled rather stupidly enough toward Mark Twain in his book, Huckleberry Finn, which arguably is in large part a critique on racism at the time, but because of its use of certain words in the context of that culture as people would have used them, it's somehow racist. And so that's kind of similar. And going back to what Lewis was saying about, you have to instill sentimentality into students rather than the other way around. As somebody who has had the opportunity to be in a classroom setting and teach those who would be considered Zoomers or Gen Z, I have really experienced that. If anything, they tend to be more pragmatic and to a certain degree, logical. And teaching something that in the liberal arts, like what I had to do, uh, actually makes it sort of difficult to explain certain things. I noticed that the analogies that I had to make to get across those ideas had to be much more concrete rather than emotional. So yeah, I did think Lewis's observation on that was quite interesting, and I could somewhat validate that from my personal experience.
All right. Now, the discussion of the Tao, where C.S. Lewis talks about objective morality, I guess where we would put this in is if the Little Green Book people put morality into these subjective mental states, he says there's a lot of problems with that, and he's gotten into some of them at this point. And so now he's saying, well, what is the answer to this? Well, there has to be some sort of object mind independent concept of what is good. And he says not only the Christians have it, but almost all world religions and philosophies have it. And so he uses an analogy of a shoe. A shoe fits as much as the shoe fits a foot. So if you want to have these moral values, but then there's no, you want the shoe, but there's no foot to put in it, then you end up having, this void, this emptiness. And he says that the difference between a classical educator and these progressive educators is that a classical educator will teach the students, what is right and what is wrong, and then how to act in accordance between those two points. Then he says the modern educator says that they're right and wrong are not meaningful statements; they're just subjective, emotive statements. So we don't have to really think about that. We're not teaching people to avoid the evil and to do the good, because those are just meaningless, subjective statements. And he then says that these new groups must either do one of two things. It must either remove sentiment as much as possible from the mind of the pupils, or through some mirage or magic trick, implement sentiments into the mind, for which there's no rational justification. So if you remove these sentiments entirely, then you can't motivate any sort of behavior, seems to be Lewis's criticism. And then if you select some over others, well, you have no rational basis to do so, because all sentiments are just subjective feelings of individuals. So Logos.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, I think he's right, but also to a degree, it just seems like at bottom, well, this is where I think he's wading into a much deeper philosophical debate that he's been prepared to discuss. Rational justifications. I mean, do we think as philosophers that all things bottom out ultimately in rational justifications? So if you're a rationalist, you might say, cogito ergo sum, and there's a bunch of assumptions I can make about myself, and maybe there's some foundational assumptions from which all things follow. But if you're an empiricist, well, we don't rationally justify anything. We just kind of have experiences and use the best thing we have at the time, induction, to make predictions and act according to predictions. But I mean, it seems to me there's a whole spectrum of positions you can take in the two, where maybe we just have values. Maybe we have things that we just think as human beings in general, as Lewis would say is the Tao. But supposing Lewis is right, and we have this Tao. I mean, me and you have talked about the Tao privately, Todd, and you had some reservations about how universally applicable, that really was, if you get to some core disagreements between cultures. But let's assume for the sake of argument that it's true. Just because the Tao is true doesn't necessarily mean we rationally follow the Tao. Maybe there's something about the human mind that can't be rationally justified by any prior assumptions, where we just think that there's some things that are true. So I don't know that couching things in rational justification is always the right thing to do. And even then, it seems to be playing the logical positivist game, because if there is a rational justification for moral propositions, it just means they're logical extensions of something else. And so you can just play the game of what are they logical extensions of? And they're either just true by definition or something else. And so it seems to be that we need like another class of thing that we can talk about. And that seems to be the work that other philosophers have done, such as Kant and other people. So I guess at risk of sounding like a broken record, this is where I just read the thing and think there's just not enough justification to get fully where he's going here. But I understand his dislike of emotivism as an ethical discipline. I think there's something wrong with that, and then also wrong with the other extreme of saying, anyway.
Okay, Master Sanders.
And kind of going to that idea of the Tao. Yeah, he does seem to be sort of taking this perennialist position that underlying all religions, all faith systems, all worldviews is some level of commonality, and I think only to a certain extent is that true. Now, from a Christian perspective or from a biblical perspective, there is this idea that there is a common understanding of morality, common among all people. In fact, in Mere Christianity, Lewis actually opens his book just with that, is this idea that we seem to appeal in our everyday lives to some sort of understood morality. What's some of the first words that a child can say? That's not fair, right? So we appeal to some level of justice and understanding. And it seems to be the task, though, of, I would say, people in his day and people in our day to sort of deconstruct this idea that actually all our values are either through experience and through social inculcation, not through and to a certain extent almost the logical conclusion of a blank slate approach, which is again, everything is just informed by our immediate surroundings. And while it is I do find it somewhat interesting that Lewis makes this argument, and again, to a limited extent, I would say he's correct that there does seem to be, on some base level, some broad understandings of morality. But even then, I think, as Logos pointed out, people don't always follow it. In fact, even the Bible says that people don't always follow it. And while a culture may tell you one thing is true, a religion may tell you one thing is true, and people act often in a way that is contrary to that religion, either subconsciously or consciously. And of course, that's why it's sort of difficult to kind of use that mentality, because even people who have this conception of the Tao, whether it's ancient Judaism or Hinduism or what have you, even people in those cultures do not always follow it. So it may not be the best place to appeal in terms of objective reasoning alone.
Well, to get to Logos's point about my skepticism of the Tao, I think the best example I can give is one that I gave in college to a professor who was making the same claim, and I said, oh great, so we all agree that honoring our ancestors is a good thing. He's like, yes. I'm like, okay, well, let me tell you this little story from Herodotus's histories. The king of Persia wanted to know what was the proper way to honor the recently deceased, so he sent messengers to Greece and messengers to the east. Messengers who went to Greece said that, well, we need to bury the dead with full funeral rites. And further to the east, the messenger said, well, they eat the flesh of their ancestors and then bury the bones in ossuaries. So they get a representative from the east and from the Greeks, and they come and meet, and both accuse the other of sacrilege. Because each accuses the other of dishonoring the dead. So how much commonality is that really, if both the Greek and the Easterner agreed that we should honor the dead, but then they both accuse the other of sacrilege? That seems to be a pretty shallow agreement, wouldn't you say, Logos?
Absolutely. And this gets to a really, really interesting thing about moral philosophy that I don't think that a lot of people really appreciate. And that's that morality isn't just something that you think about or follows from some objective set of facts or values. Morality is something that you do. So you can't say that two people have the same morality just because they share a value in common. Morality is inextricably linked to how people act in the face of their values. You interpret your values through action. And so the Greeks, here's the thing. While the Greeks and the Persians would both say in that situation, they both value honoring the dead, the Greek would point to the Persian and say, you are not honoring your dead. And the Persian would point to the Greek and say, you are not honoring your dead, right? So how could it be that they both value honoring their dead, but neither of them are honoring their dead relative to the other's claim? Now, if Lewis is right, and there's something in the act itself that necessitates the emotional, or maybe emotional is the wrong word, necessitates the value judgment about the action, then again, we get back to the New York and Chicago style pizza. We have a Schrodinger's act here, where the Greeks and the Persians are both honoring and not honoring their dead based on who's opening the box or based on who's examining the action. And that's a really uncomfortable thing to think about, which is why I think that Lewis' analysis could have done with another layer of complexity here.
Yeah, that does seem to be one of the. Let me put it this way: he is correct that there needs to be a universal, mind-independent, ethical frame of reference.
Yes.
I think where C.S. Lewis is maybe not as tight as he needs to be is grounding that in the Tao, because it's not at all clear from this little thought experiment that Herodotus gives us that is the proper way to do it. Master Sanders.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of to Logos's point, and is that, again, even if people, superficially hold to broad principles, the application of that, especially in under stress, may be quite different. As sort of like going back with Todd's understanding of what burying the dead, or sorry, honoring the dead. While only on a superficial level could you say that, yeah, they both they share that value, but of course, based on large part experience and the tenets of their religion, makes those very difficult.
Exactly. Now, he then. Okay, so even if because we've heard from you, Logos, you're sort of. I would agree. C.S. Lewis does tend to jump around, and the underlying logic isn't always clear. And I think that's definitely one of your criticisms. But when we look at his statement that there's only two possible choices for an emotivist to take, they should either remove sentiment entirely from their course, which would, I don't know how you'd even do that, and then privilege one set of sentiments over another, without actually telling the students you're doing that. So that would be dishonest. And then second of all, how would one go about doing that? Because any argument you could give for courage would just be a description of a subjective internal state that is meaningless.
I'm sorry. We're talking to me?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So here's where I think there might even be a third category there. What I think that the people could do in this situation, if they're emotivists, is instead of either trying to remove all sentiments or privilege a sentiment, what they could do is just play kind of a metagame analysis and say, well, look, if we're going to assume that people just have these sentiments when they look at literature or when they act in the world, we could just take the meta role of instructors of helping people, A, clarify what their sentiments are, B, trying to figure out where their sentiments come from. And this is where actually I think if somebody takes this path, they'll agree with Lewis. Because let's suppose that two people see something and maybe disagree about the sentiment of the thing they're seeing, but they have different reasons for their disagreement. Well, if you follow those reasons back far enough, they might actually get to the same value. And that's what Lewis is talking about. He's talking about the Tao. He's not actually talking about morality or moral action or anything like that. He's talking about like base values. And so what the emotivist could do is especially since some emotivists I've talked to have made the claim that you can't always control your values. Your values are just kind of like a thing you're given. And so what you can control is, how you interpret your values, act on your values. And there might be some things that you find are in conflict with the values that you have. And so now you have this path from the emotions that the students have back to the values the students hold. And then maybe now you can actually get from there to a discussion about the Tao, and they can actually meet Lewis and discuss it on those terms. Where I think the grave mistake that emotivists make today is they do one of those things that Lewis talks about. And this is a bad thing to do. And this is why I give pragmatist philosophy some of the benefit of the doubt, because they actually embrace the madness, so to speak, and say, look, things are kind of irreducibly normative. So let's look and see like what kinds of things drive our normative impulses, embrace them, and then talk about them. And so they would actually get to the Tao in the same place that Lewis does and kind of meet him there. So I agree with Lewis's frustration. I do think there's a way to add complexity to the conversation.
Okay, Mr. Sanders.
I don't quite have anything to add to that.
Okay. He makes an illustration to differentiate his position from that of the Little Green Book. He says that his position seeks to initiate somebody into the ways things have always been. So teaching young bird how to fly. And then he says that the new way is essentially telling the bird what it's going to be used for. Like maybe it's, I guess, useful. Or one analogy is going to be a messenger pigeon or something, which it's not, but you don't know why you're doing it. You're just taught how to do it so that when you're told to do it, you do it. And he then argues that because we're just told how to do things, not why we do things, that then creates a lot of social problems.
Now, this is where I can jump in as a math instructor and fully agree with him. I teach statistics a lot and math a lot and things like that. And people have this view where math is just objectively right. 2 plus 2 is always 4, and we'll always follow those statistics. But I mean, as we've talked about privately, talking about politics and current events and so on, there are multiple kinds of statistics. There are multiple ways to read statistics. Statistics tell a story that you want them to tell. And so if all you ever learn is how to use statistics and trust data and trust all this stuff, you never ask the really interesting questions about like who's making the data, or who's gathering the data, for what are they gathering the data? Did they leave something out? So this is a problem even in STEM, which is divorced from kind of the literary critique that Lewis is talking about. But even in the field that's useful, there's a danger of just teaching people to use tools and not like, hey, there's actually, if you follow the tools back in the way they're used, there's like a normative reason somebody did what they did. And you should try to think about why they did it and if it was correct for them to do so. So yeah, I fully agree with Lewis here, even as a math guy.
All right, great. Master Sanders. Yeah, and again, my area of expertise is a bit more in the liberal arts, more so than in STEM. But even then, I've noticed, particularly with younger people, and this has been a problem for some time, is that they don't really have this notion of critical thinking skills and being able to question those things, as you point out with data, as to they know how to read things on the surface level, but not so much ask the why questions effectively. And so I've noticed that as well in my teaching experience.
Yeah. Now, what then Lewis wants to end with, and I think this is partly what you've been waiting for, Logos, is Logos's position is if this new education removes sentiment, teaches us to think of sentiment as fundamentally meaningless, but then also still wants to hold on to some sort of normative action, how does it then get people to think normatively about these actions and then act in the heat of the moment? As he says, if you're getting shot at, a syllogism about doing what is right isn't going to keep you in the trenches. It's going to be a whole host of other sensations, i.e. sentiment, that will keep you going. And then he sort of ends with this discussion of the tripartite view of man from the Greeks. Reason rules the belly through the chest. So, and spirit would be the Greek thumos. And by getting rid of that, because that's just sentiment, that's backward, we can get rid of that. Then actually, this is actually kind of dovetailing with Hume's dictum that ethics is just human reason for the service of human appetite, and that really does seem to be what he's getting at in criticizing here.
Yeah, I agree actually with all that. I was going to say something, I just lost my train of thought, so I'll let Sanders go first and see if I can remember what I was going to say.
Yeah. I did find that part rather interesting. Is trying to reduce everything to a far more logical, I guess rather clever, to borrow some phrase, rather clever approach to deducing what is right in the face of adversity, rather than to having basically a heart that does embrace certain sentiments. And I that's probably, again, that we're even seeing that today with a generation of people that are rather clever, even intellectually, even if they are rather logical in that way, but they cannot. But as Lewis said, they don't necessarily have the moral oomph or basis to actually do the right thing in the face of adversity.
Yeah, we just were joined by Right Ruminations. So yeah, we are going over the first lecture of the Abolition of Man lectures, Men Without Chests, and we just sort of covered the main focus of it. I think maybe you can help us out here a little bit. Well, one of the things that Logos mentioned earlier was when C.S. Lewis goes from the idea that if attributions of value are just a description of internal dispositions and therefore meaningless, how do you get from that to the Tao?
Well, I mean, the word that comes to mind is honesty, and obviously I don't have the full context of the discussion because I haven't done the readings, as it were, at least not recently. But from what I've been able to gather from the little I've heard from this conversation, in reference to the question that you asked, is that I think that this disparity between what the person's subjective sentiments are and what is required of them, let's say, according to some moral objective standard, is something that can be bridged by reference to the quality of honesty. That is, how many people actually face any moral dilemma by setting aside whatever it is that they want to be true and saying, well, what do I really think about this? It's not even really a question of to what extent are humans objective or not objective. It's almost a question of the extent to which how many humans actually bother even to know what they think about something or what even they feel about something. So in a sense, I think that this problem of bridging the subjective with the objectively true or morally laudable is that you have basically a problem, a movement wherein someone becomes closer to that if even on a subjective level they even bother to be honest. This really relates to a theme that comes up in my denomination, which is the Roman Catholic Church, in which you have this doctrine called invincible ignorance. So the idea is that if somebody's a non-believer, but there are certain conditions met, then they might be a believer in spirit, even if they don't know that Christianity is the truth. Whereas then there are some visible Christians who may profess Christ but are not in their hearts Christian. And it can be complicated to sort out, well, how could one be one and the other be the other? How do you know? How do you know what to make of this? And I really do think that a good test is honesty. If you have the rare pagan who actually is a pagan because they actually sat down and asked themselves, is this actually what I believe? Is this actually what I think is true? Then I suppose that's indicative of good conscience. If you have a Christian who may even have all the proper conservative beliefs, but he only is doing it because, I don't know, he's a contrarian, or because he wants to appear to be conservative because it's classy or something like that, then that may very well be someone who's not actually a Christian in spirit. So I do think that the way to bridge this disparity is by emphasizing the importance of subjective honesty. I hope that that's contextually pertinent to the conversation you've been having.
Logos, does that help?
Absolutely. Yeah, this goes exactly back to what I was saying about the third path that the Emotivist could do in order to bridge himself with Lewis, where instead of removing all sentiment or trying to privilege some sentiments over others, what they can do is get the students to think critically and meta-analyze that they have sentiments, why they have sentiments, where the values their sentiments come from, and kind of backtrace and kind of help students guide along the path of exactly what Right Ruminations was talking about. And I think if Lewis acknowledged that third path and discussed that honestly, I think that'd be interesting. Another person I've heard that from, not quite the same way, is Jordan Peterson. Be honest, regardless of what you're told to do, regardless of anything else. If something morally disagrees with you, think about it and respond honestly. And I think that's a really good thing to think about.
Yeah, Master Sanders, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think Right Ruminations and Logos got it.
Well, great. Let's see. Is there anything else that we have left to discuss, or maybe that we could piggyback to that would be useful?
I remembered what I was going to say earlier and forgot. It seems interesting that Lewis brings up the example of the person acting in the trench in the moment, right? There is no syllogism of how one ought to act when they're in the field of battle that's going to convince them to do something. Now, it's interesting hearing that part in the later stage juxtaposed with Lewis's argument that there's no rational basis for preferring one sentiment over another one. It seems to me that in the last part of the section here, Lewis is admitting that there is no rational or syllogistic or base axiomatic reason for why people do what they do. In the heat of the moment, they kind of have the values and act on them, and it's kind of like a bundled qualitative experience all in one that they can kind of reflect on after the fact, but in the moment they don't have the luxury. And so it seems when Lewis says, well, there's no rational reason for one sentiment over another one, he's right. But he just admitted that even if one follows his logic, there's no rational reason for having and following through one's values anyway. It kind of happens. And so that tension Lewis discover in the middle and end of his work is interesting to note.
Well, just as a point of clarification, couldn't one say, though, that what Lewis is getting at, Logos, is in the safety of your own armchair, smoking a pipe by the fire, you can rationally attempt to justify your beliefs, but that would neither be useful or prudent to do so in the heat of battle.
Yeah, exactly. And more to that, even if one does try to rationalize their beliefs in an armchair, many people are just floored to figure out that they acted in a way contrary to how they thought they would act. In fact, there's good research on, post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that, where veterans just say that they didn't think themselves capable of doing some of the things they had to do in battle. They tell themselves, I'm not that kind of person. I wouldn't do that, that sort of thing. But when push comes to shove, it turns out they are that kind of person. They have to really work through some mental stuff. And so, yeah, that seems to me to add to the credence that not all moral actions and values in that way are rationally what we think they are.
Yeah, Ruminations, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we can sort of divide this into two types of rationalism. So, on the one hand, I would agree with what's being said here in that you're not going to ultimately be motivated by adherence to syllogisms. That is, I think even in the long term, people are not all that motivated by even in terms of, say, something like their belief in God. There's only so far that you can get with a syllogism. So in terms of rationalistic reason, then I think that is sort of more the domain of philosophers. That's more of an art or a topic of intellectual connoisseurs, which is fine as it goes, and maybe it can tell us about things that can be demonstrated, but it's not useful in that kind of immediate way. However, if by reason what you mean is acting on some kind of evidence as part of some kind of internal dialectic, then I guess reason can be motivational because it's ultimately informed by the person's own sort of existential self-understanding. So I've noticed this also in Christian circles, that there's kind of equivocation that goes on with the term reason or rationalism. So on the one hand, it can mean reason in the sense that, say, Thomas Aquinas used reason, or to the extent in the way that C.S. Lewis himself uses reason, where it is a kind of systematic use of reason to demonstrate something. And so I suppose in that case, there is a gap between what one knows rationally and how one will actually act. But I believe that there's a more immediately pertinent kind of reason, which is more like relating to what I said before about honesty, but in a way that's informed by any number of different kinds of reasons. So why do people actually believe things or actually act in a certain way? They sometimes they look to their emotions, they look to their intuition, sometimes they look to empirical fact, sometimes they do look to syllogisms, but that in light of all of this evidence, their experience, their feelings, their intuition, the facts, whatever, that they can honestly then look at all this and say, somewhere in light of all this information, I have decided to believe this, or I assent to believe this. And in that sense, there is a type of rationalism that maybe does have an immediate influence on how the person acts, if that's what you understand by the use of reason.
Logos, some thoughts?
No, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. It seems, I think I agree with Right Ruminations when he says that Lewis seems to use reason as kind of like a systemization of thought. But it seems that if me and Right Ruminations agree here that what's going on is like this subjective, honest examination from one's values, their own existential being, in light of the information they have, to what they ought to do and act and think, then we both agree that that's rational, but it's not rational, I think, in the way that Lewis would accept, because it does, devolve back into one's subjective existential, state and the kind of person that they are, rather than what Lewis wants to talk about as some objective natural law, kind of like grounding of the way things are instead of the way you are. So yeah, I think that reason is rational if we take, mine and Right Ruminations' view on it, and it just seems to be contrary to Lewis's view. And I think me and Right Ruminations do agree that Lewis kind of contradicts himself when he tries to have his cake and eat it with, one should have systematic reasons for holding these feelings over these other feelings or privileging them, but also in a trench, none of that matters. So I think we're all in agreement there.
Master Sanders, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, again, Right Ruminations and Logos pretty much express my sentiment there too.
Okay, well, I think we more or less completely covered the first essay, unless there's anything else anybody wants to say. I think it's probably about time to wrap up. So thanks again, Logos, Master Sanders, and Right Ruminations. And also thank you, Ricardo Williams, for mentioning that I should invite Right Ruminations. This has been a very interesting discussion, and we have 2 more lectures to go through. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.